Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second event of the Reproduction and Religion Public Pedagogies Project. This virtual conversation series is sponsored by the Luce AAR Advancing Public Scholarship Grant Program, and it's a part of the Reproductive Righteousness Project. The three of us pictured here on the screen on the right are the series organizers. We're excited to bring experts on religion and reproduction into interdisciplinary conversations in order to support a community of scholars, advocates, and practitioners on these important yet often under-addressed topics. We're motivated to gather in a time of intensifying hostility to reproductive, queer, trans, racial, and other human rights because we believe open public discussion about the intersections of religious and reproductive politics is as urgent as ever. So we'll be playing three roles today. Risa is our tech MC. If you have any issues, please directly message her. Mickey will be moderating the panel discussion, and Leah, will introduce the events and the speakers. So we're really thrilled to have two experts with us today to discuss the diverse ways that race and reproduction intersect. We want to take a few minutes to introduce you to each speaker, and then we'll dive into a conversation. So Lina-Maria Murillo is assistant professor in the departments of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, History, and Latina Studies at the University of Iowa. She is completing her first book titled Fighting for Control, Power, Reproductive Care, and Race in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, forthcoming with the University of North Carolina Press this fall. We can't wait for that. Her writing appears in the Washington Post, Rewire News, Nursing Clio, and Notches. And her latest academic article won the 2023 Catherine Stimson Prize for Outstanding Feminist Scholarship in Science. Her research has been supported by several grants and fellowships, including the American Association of University Women, American Council of Learned Societies, and the Ford Foundation. Together with Professor Natalie Fixer-Orez, Murillo co-directs the Maternal Health and Reproductive Justice Obermann Collaborative at the University of Iowa. We're so happy that you're with us today. Elizabeth O'Brien is our second speaker today. She is an assistant professor of the History of Medicine and Latin American History in the Department of History at UCLA. O'Brien's book, Surgery and Salvation, The Roots of Reproductive Injustice in Mexico between 1770 and 1940, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in November 2023. Surgery and Salvation illuminates how religious and theological ideas influenced obstetric surgery over time, how race and class became organizing logics for discourses about surgical advancements, and how childbearing people in Mexico experienced and sometimes contested the ways in which patriarchal medical authorities influenced their reproductive choices. This fantastic book received the Best Book Award from the 19th Century section of the Latin American Studies Association and the Judy Ewald Award from the Rocky Mountain Council of Latin American Studies. So we have much to learn from both of you, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, I want to reiterate again how excited I am that you both are here and that we are having this wonderful conversation together. This is meant to be a conversation, so at any point, please feed off of each other and the questions that I've given you. We'll take about 50-ish minutes to kind of have a conversation between the two of you. I will ask some guiding questions. If you take a few minutes to 5 minutes to answer each question, that'd be wonderful. But feel free to kind of make it a discussion between the two of you as well. And then at around 1 o'clock, we'll kind of transition to some Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some great conversation with our audience as well. So I want to open up to let our audience first know that you feel free to put comments and questions in the chat at any point. Our other organizers will be collecting these, and we'll be able to ask these later in the conversation. So I would love, Lina and Elizabeth, for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work. How did you come to focus on these intersections of race and reproductive politics, as well as religion? And let's start first with Dr. Lina-Maria Murillo.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burdick, and recently, thank you everybody so much for coming and for this wonderful invitation. That's a great question. I originally didn't know what I what I wanted to do with my life. I mean, quite frankly, I was taking a very long time, kind of getting through my education. Could have probably gotten a PhD at community college. I was there so long. And finally, when I got myself together, I was like, wow, I really do love history. This is a thing that I find fascinating, and I also think that there is a way to think about present day issues and present day concerns, and understanding them through history, right? What got us to this particular moment? And at the time, the thing that I was very much interested in was thinking about gender-based violence, and specifically violence against women. I was taken by the more recent history of feminicides along the U.S.-Mexico border. And so in 2000, late 2007, I decided, I'm going to go to the US-Mexico border. I'm going to go to El Paso, Texas, to study this phenomenon. And of course, when I got there, literally within months, the Mexican state, the president at the time, who's Cardenas, went to war with narco trafficking organizations along the border. Violence sort of skyrocketed along the border region, sort of increasing this issue of feminicides to a sort of deafening degree, and also just massive amounts of sort of rampant violence in various communities, but especially in El Paso, and well, I should say in Ciudad Juarez, which is the sister city to El Paso, Texas. And so it shut down that possibility for me to study violence. It was literally happening. And so I was puttering around in the archive and just also kind of confused about what I was going to do in the sort of midst of this awful situation that cut off our ability to really do borderland scholarship, right? In many ways, we were cut off from the other side of our studies of our world, which would have been Mexico. And I happened to be talking to one of the archivists, and she said, I know you're, kind of trying to figure things out now that this awful situation is happening in Mexico, but we just got all of the papers from the local Planned Parenthood organization, and they had just recently closed. So this is early 2009. And really I was in some ways also surprised by the fact that from one day to the next, it had just shut down. This is actually before the state of Texas had began to sort of increase its attacks against Planned Parenthood. It turned out that there had been massive sort of internal financial discrepancies in the organization, and they shut down from one day to the next. They left all of their papers to the University of Texas, El Paso. And so I spent the next over a decade of my life reading those papers, understanding the rationale for why El Paso was chosen as a site for a birth control clinic in 1937. And it propelled me to travel to various places in the United States to look at the history of Planned Parenthood and to understand it specifically in connection to the Mexican origin community in the US-Mexico border region. And also compelled me to ask questions about its relationship to Ciudad Juarez. And so that essentially is what my book is about. It's about the history and the long and troubled relationship between Planned Parenthood, Mexican origin women in the border region, and on the one hand, sort of demands by Mexican origin women, especially poor Mexican origin women, to have autonomy over their bodies, over their labor, over their family making and community making on the one hand, and on the other, sort of very consistent population control rhetoric coming from organizations like Planned Parenthood. And then later on, throughout the 20th century, this rhetoric emerges in Mexico, and in particular in northern Mexico, by a person I'm calling sort of the Margaret Sanger of the US-Mexico border in Ciudad Juarez. So that's, in a nutshell, my kind of trajectory.
I'm very excited to pick up your book in the fall, or coming very soon. Dr. Elizabeth O'Brien, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and how you came to these intersections as well?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mickey Burdick. First of all, I wanted to thank you again, Dr. Burdick, Dr. Targan, and Dr. Cromer for the invitation and for coordinating and hosting such a rich series of conversations, and especially for bringing Dr. Murillo and I together for this chance to talk. I want to, as ever, send my warmest thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Lina-Maria Murillo, who's an eminent, wise beyond her years, dedicated, inspiring, generous, and really incredible scholar of history and important voice in the reproductive justice movement and reproductive justice history. So it's been an honor to be in conversation with her since we met at a Berks in 2016, and fun to have this opportunity today. I didn't know how your research interest started, so great to be able to share about this. Okay, so one of the reasons why I framed so many of my comments around Dr. Murillo's forthcoming Fighting for Control, Power, Reproductive Care, and Race in the US-Mexico Borderlands is that I had the chance to read it. So I'll try to reflect on some intersections, and also just generally plug the book, which, as you have already said, is coming out soon. So in terms of my own research, I began kind of thinking about these questions, the intersections of religion, race, and reproduction in Mexico City in 2007. So, not too long off from when you were in El Paso. I was in Mexico City. I ended up there, trying to improve my Spanish. And yeah, I was there, like I said, in 2007, very impressionable 19-year-old at the time. And I saw a couple of exhibits in public spaces. One of them, which kind of, made the biggest impact, was both in the metro and throughout several metro stations. So you kind of, couldn't help but interact with it as you were walking through the metro stations. But it was also, the subject of these big installations in the Parque de Chapultepec as well. And so it was kind of hitting you wherever you went in, or it hit me in several places in central Mexico City. And it was about maternal mortality. And it was about the goals that the WHO had set for Mexico achieving a acceptable level of maternal mortality by the year 2005, which according to the exhibit, Mexico had not succeeded in attaining these maternal mortality goals. And the exhibit was just so evocative because it depicted birthing people's bodies that had been plastered in cloth that had been dried, like this thick paper mache, in order to make them look like ghosts that were haunting the metro and that were haunting the city. And this really inspired, my interest in the topic, because, I had been kind of exposed to discourses around gendered violence and also around reproduction. And also because my mom did emergency nursing, I had been exposed to kind of, spaces of emergency reproduction as, knowledge-making spaces. And so I started to look into why maternal mortality was so high in Mexico. And, I saw that basically there was this whole history having to do, especially with race and access to healthcare, but also access to pregnancy termination services and to, safe and dignified reproductive health care that is, can otherwise be deadly, as we know, if people don't have access, for example, to pregnancy termination. And so basically that, inspired my work, which looks at kind of the intersection of reproductive politics in Mexico, with a focus on developments in obstetric and gynecological surgery from 1770 to 1940. It kind of starts in the Borderlands because that's where modern obstetric surgery started in Mexico, and then focuses increasingly on Mexico City. And what I'm particularly interested in is how metaphysical ideas, including religious ideas and theological ideas, were made and remade by transformations of the flesh itself via surgery. So surgery was never, obstetric and gynecological surgery is never just about therapeutics. It's never, just straightforwardly about medical knowledge. It's also always about all these social ideas about race, reproduction, religion. So I'm very interested in how, childbearing people's bodies, including bodies that are gendered as women's bodies, the bodies of people with uteruses, are utilized in the making of modern medical knowledge. And some of this has to do with the history of medical ethics, especially since obstetrics and gynecology are specialties that are so muddied by these ideas about, these historical ideas about women's proper place in society and what, their bodies are best used for. This has, in the modern era been the subject of contention in medical knowledge making. So I offered this kind of genealogy of experimental and politicized surgical interventions, beginning with religious surgeries in the 18th century, which theologically speaking were based on the premise that the fetal soul was more important and more worth saving than the mother's life. And because this argument is being made alongside the beginning of the modern use of the cesarean operation, then what I do is kind of track this obsession with maternal worth and the fetal soul as a kind of ideological underpinning of future developments in reproductive health care, culminating in eugenics in the 20th century. But what's interesting about, these arguments about what's worth more, fetal soul or maternal life, is that it's not a straightforward trajectory. Oftentimes, stakeholders in making medical knowledge and in debating fetal soul and maternal life are actually going against that grain. Of these kind of 18th century religious arguments about the importance of saving fetal souls. And so obstetric and gynecological knowledge is kind of, made in this dialectic with its religious underpinnings. So that's kind of, an overview of the book.
Amazing and amazing overlaps between your work, gendered violence, even labor of peoples and the use of their bodies throughout history. It's obvious that you two are in conversation with each other academically. So that's really wonderful, and I'm really excited about that. And I guess I'll kind of tip it back over to Dr. Murillo and ask, which it obviously does, which I know it does, but how does reproductive justice inform your research, community engagement, advocacy, and sort of other activities that you're involved in? We know that it's a big part of your work, both of your works, but how does it inform these works and other activities?
So thank you for that question. I should say, Elizabeth, you're very generous with your words of my work, but I should say that oftentimes Elizabeth's book came out before mine, and she had several articles that also came out before a lot of my work did. So in some ways, she made it really easy for me to make some of the arguments that I'm making in my work, because, and this is, I think, to get to one of the things that I think RJ does very well in academic work, right? So there's like the scholarship and then the praxis, right? So there's the work that I know Liz and I both try to do, like in our writing for the academy, and then the work that we do in our communities, either in the border region or where we live now. So I live in Iowa. And we can definitely talk about that, I hope, a little later, kind of what dealing with the sort of on the ground conditions in different states between a place like Iowa and California. But one of the, for me, one of the important things about RJ is that it actually has us think critically about race and gender as a sort of intersectional, intersectional issues. And one of the things that I often found lacking, right, because I write about the border region, but to be fair, most of my work is sort of focused on the U.S. and nationhood and thinking about nations is complicated when you're dealing with movements and ideas that actually do transgress borders, right? You have people kind of producing medical knowledge and producing politics around reproduction, and often either trying to export these ideas or be in conversation with people. And so one of the things that Elizabeth's work helped me do was in many ways push back on this idea that the United States was the sort of like the always the producer of all medical knowledge, and that other countries, especially so-called countries in the global South, were just always the receivers of this information. And were it not for the United States, these other countries, especially in Latin America, would just be in abject darkness about about medicine and the advent of technology. So, writing about the sort of history of abortion, that's not part of my book necessarily, but I have written extensively on the history of underground abortion networks in the U.S.-Mexico border region, especially in Juarez and Tijuana. And one of the things that Elizabeth's work helped me really do, and I hope to pull out further in some of my my forthcoming work on abortion, is the fact that physicians in Mexico were trained in this, right? They knew how, and they talked about it, and they discussed it, and they were, what do we do in a country, and this is post-Mexican Revolution, that as sort of part of its sort of revolutionary vision was to create universal healthcare, right? And that they were thinking about this, and they were writing about it, and they were teaching that to each other, right? And so, of course, it makes, right? Because oftentimes the way that people in the US would write about Mexican providers along the border is that they were all butchers, that these were not physicians, that these people were not trained. And that was a way to sort of, one, lean into the racism about what people in the US thought was going on in Mexico, this, poor, backwards country, and that women were always risking their lives. American women were always risking their lives by going into, a dusty, dirty Mexican clinic. When some of the physicians I've written about, and even some of the abortion providers who were not physicians, but who were trained by physicians, knew their stuff, right? And knew how to provide good, proper care. And so, in that way, I think like it's been so helpful to have Elizabeth's work, because I'm like she's done, all of this work kind of helping us clearly understand the history of medicine in Mexico, and especially with regards to reproduction. And so for me, that's the kind of work that I think, to connect all of it to RJ is asking us to do that type of deeper analysis, right? To think about racism, to think about gendered violence, and how they work together to sort of hide these deeper, richer histories, especially when we're centering communities of color, communities in the global South, and to sort of and sometimes as they are being themselves very problematic, right? The history of eugenics in Mexico is quite long and troubling. So it's not just to say that that we're centering these histories as a way to glorify or whatever communities of color, but also to say, in many ways, eugenics did not escape, did not escape, all sorts of nations. This was an international, transnational project. And so for me, that's the sort of power that reproductive justice as a framework for scholarship has had for me.
Mickey, would you like me to respond to?
Yes, that would be wonderful, Dr. O'Brien. Thank you.
Okay, well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for your generous words. And, yeah, again, I found this quote from your book that I wanted to share, which, is partially it's from the epilogue summing up what it does on the whole. Fighting for control traces the contours and inflection points of a systemic and structural gendered racism focused squarely on Mexican descent women's reproduction. It is also about how Mexican origin women lived through it, fought back, and used contraception for their own emancipation while lifting each other and their communities along the way. And so, this is just, it's so exciting. It is the first book about contraception, eugenics, population making, demographics, women's and people with uteruses agency and resistance and actions and interactions with all of these books in the Borderlands. It goes up to the closing of the Planned Parenthood clinic, uses records from trials that we didn't even know were happening of contraceptions on the border, like the, hormonal contraception trials that were happening in Puerto Rico, were also being trialed in El Paso, but you flip the script on these in a way that I think, really embodies the reproductive justice framework. And so I'll kind of, come back to that at that end of my answer. But, for me, from like kind of the origin story of where, I saw these ghosts haunting the city, and then also basically just also, I want to be honest about my own positionality and subjectivity growing up in a family of single mothers, being raised by single mothers, becoming a single mother as an undergraduate. I'm always thinking about these gendered structures of power and justice and injustice. So for me, the past is inseparable from present injustices, against people's reproductive capacities and freedoms. So I try to be very, very careful when I'm talking about, 18th and 19th century documents. I don't read them in a presentist or anachronistic way, but when I frame my entire book, it is framed, by reproductive justice. And part of that is because, when I was really rewriting the book and rewriting the dissertation, there was this mass feminist uprising in Mexico that has achieved so much, along with the feminist uprising in Argentina, in Colombia, all throughout Latin America. And so, not only is pregnancy termination decriminalized now throughout Mexico by the Supreme Court, but it is illegal to prosecute anybody who helps anybody else terminate a pregnancy in Mexico now. And so that means that women and people with uteruses and just people in general are legally empowered and protected to do what they have always done, which is to help each other look for, reproductive healthcare solutions. And it's illegal for states to go after them for that, even though states still do. And so there's, but then there's this also huge network of NGOs and feminist activists that file these, legal challenges that are routed through judges who oftentimes side, with reproductive health care and the guarantee for reproductive health care. And part of what's so special, I think, about the more recent 2021 Supreme Court decision in Mexico as well, is that it specifically made the language around this trans inclusionary. In order to, recognize that it's not just women who become pregnant and who need to terminate pregnancies. And so, I am my everything about my scholarship and my knowledge of these topics is indebted to the Mexican feminist movement, past and present. And of course, also, so when I was an undergrad, I was reading things like Incite Women of Color Against Violence, really key to my understanding of these topics. And as a graduate student during coursework, I never would have conceptualized this project, as most of us would probably say about our work, without reading Dorothy Roberts' Killing the Black Body and its long genealogy of reproductive control based in racism and violence against African descent women. And then also, reading that alongside thinkers like Cristina Rivera Garza was very mind-blowing, because she had long ago worked with the same kind of sources that I worked with and was reimagining them in these really creative literary ways. And now, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist for writing about femicide and violence against women. I also want to shout out Alex Mina Stern, who runs the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab, because reading her alongside Nancy Steppen on the history of eugenics in Mexico was really incredible, because she helped forge this reproductive justice approach to the history of eugenics writ large, not just in the US, not just in the Borderlands, but also in Mexico. And so it's really been like kind of a transnational scholarly movement as well. And then, the last thing that I want to say about reproductive justice and Mexican reproductive history is that, there are all of these really important thinkers who have been doing this work in conversation with United States-based Black reproductive justice activists, Black and women of color, for a long time. And this movement insists that because the state exerts power over us, it is the state's responsibility to create pathways towards and egalitarian access to, and I'm quoting from Lina's book here, quote, 1, the right to have children, 2, the right not to have children, 3, the right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities, and 4, the inalienable right to bodily autonomy, end quote. So these feminists insist that anything less constitutes state-sponsored violence against entire groups of people, childbearing and potentially childbearing people as a whole. So for them, the state knows that abortion bans kill people with uteruses. And so when they deny access to abortion, they are not just restricting women's rights, but they are instead deliberately killing people. And we know this, but we know this from the history of reproductive justice analysis, right? And so this analysis of state power really stems from deeply rooted feminist movements in the region, and especially their ability to hold accountable authoritarian states, especially those, that were really murderous and authoritarian from the 1970s to the 1990s, and help set the terms on which truth, reconciliation, and redemocratization processes happened. So it emerged from an ability to call out these murderous states and take them to task. And I just fundamentally agree with this analysis, especially because my work shows the degree to which violent social attitudes really shape the direction of, and oftentimes non-therapeutic, medical interventions that were more about saving society from women than saving women's lives during obstetric emergencies. And this is, the framework that Lina-Maria uses in her book, right? Because she doesn't frame things through just rights or constitutional rights or, pro or like pre-Roe versus post-Roe and the big progress narrative and, the right to privacy and the right to abortion, but instead she sees it, under this structural lens that includes all these nuances of agency and of power struggles and of, reconciling, having to collaborate with eugenicists, right, in order to access contraception and using it for your own means while rejecting the eugenicist logic behind it. And she scales this through different class levels and really looks deeply into different people's investments and practices. And yeah, so that's kind of my response to that.
I really love the framing from both of you about reproductive justice in your work, especially just thinking about how it is more complicated when you bring in an RJ perspective. And that's the point, right, is to really get down to those histories and those analyses that are sometimes overlooked and also sometimes simplified in ways that are not helpful for most marginalized people. So I really appreciate both of your very nuanced analyses, which often make it harder, right, to do those sorts of things and tell those stories. So thank you very much for both of your work. I want to talk a little bit about, and maybe Dr. Elizabeth O'Brien, you could start us off this time, because I know that your work, a lot of your work directly speaks about religion as well. And I know Dr. Murillo, yours does as well. But I would love to hear a little bit about how your work speaks to gaps in our dominant conversations around race, religion, specifically, as well as reproduction. So what misconceptions about these intersections does your work address? And what would you like people through your work to better understand about, race, religion, and reproduction?
Okay, well, thanks, Mickey. And, Dr. Murillo already answered this to a large extent, so I'll try and keep it short, keep the conversation flowing. A lot of people assume that because the Catholic Church made public statements in opposition to eugenic sterilization in the 20th century, that so-called Latin or Catholic eugenic countries had some kind of a cultural opposition to eugenic sterilization. And, my book shows that while and not just my work, but I'm in conversation with lots of other people like Laura Suarez Lopez Iguazo, Alex Stern herself, I think Nancy Steppen would agree with what we're all saying, right? Beatriz Orcasitas, there's so many people doing this work, right? So it's obviously not just me, even though I know my work the best. So let's see. Even though religion is always relevant, there were, really active efforts on the part of eugenicists to sterilize large numbers of women in Mexico City, for example. And so, we didn't, in Mexico, there wasn't the same, legalistic eugenic sterilization board based sterilization campaigns as in the United States. And so it was fundamentally different, but there is that history there, right? That we need to understand on its own terms. While also seeing it in conversation with, eugenics in the United States, because Karen Rosenblatt, for example, she wrote this book, the politics and science of race in the United States and Mexico. And she shows that, especially when it came to questions about indigeneity, scientists in Mexico and the United States were really, sharing, co-producing, 20th century ideas about race and indigeneity. And so, Mexico in a lot of ways is perhaps more in conversation with the United States, if I can say that, than perhaps it is in conversation with France, for example, by the 1930s, for example. Okay. And then the other thing is just that, we don't usually think of Catholic priests and nuns as making modern reproductive knowledge, but I really do think that the knowledge that they were making, in the 18th and 19th centuries should be seen as modern and should be placed within these modern genealogies of reproductive control, for a lot of reasons. And we also, we tend to assume maybe, or the common person could tend to assume, that the Catholic Church has always claimed that life, quote unquote, quote, begins at conception, or, starts, shortly after fecundation. And what do we mean by life? And, the life of the embryo. So of course, these are all like very complicated things. And we tend to think that the Catholic Church must have this like centuries old, or, like position on it. But really, they didn't even remove the distinction between unanimated and animated fetuses until 1869. So it's only been less than 150 years that that's even been the Catholic Church's official position. And like Nora Jaffrey says, Nora Jaffrey has written all this really, really incredible stuff about abortion in Mexico. And she's really challenged the idea of, some like culturally predetermined, deeply rooted Catholic opposition to abortion in Mexico. She's like, no, Mexico didn't have the Comstock Act. It didn't, women, there's a reason women were going from the United States to Mexico for abortions. Mexico has a long and rich and storied history of abortion. You can't just say, oh, well, it's a very Catholic country. So we know that Catholic women, statistically speaking, have more abortions, per capita than other women of other religions. And so my book kind of shows, how this fits into these historical discourses.
I think that's a really interesting history, and again, more complicated than one makes it out to be. Dr. Murillo.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna second Elizabeth's comment here, because I do think that that's, for me, what was so powerful, and it's been so powerful about Elizabeth's work, is that in many ways it dispels these, again, for me, they're very much, at least coming from a US focus, they're very tied to race and racism, right? The way that religion and race are constructed together here. There are, decades worth of anti-Catholic sentiment in the US. And while that may have in some ways gone away, in places like the Northeast, where some of these communities, right, became quote unquote white, that's not the case for Mexicanos and Latinos in the Southwest. And even as our communities traveled throughout the US, and sort of, right, that there is something very specifically different about being Catholic and Latino versus being Catholic and Irish, or being Catholic and German. And so it's being Catholic and Black. I mean, I think that there is something about Catholicism in Latin America that has allowed the political elite in the US and the powerful to say, though, those people are just backwards, right? Like this is part of their inability for self-governance, right? They're always looking to the papacy for guidance on everything. And so in many ways, I think Elizabeth's work, and I apologize for making this a love fest on each other, but we are friends, number one. And number two, we hardly ever get to be in conversation with each other like this. We're usually, in some like sad, quiet workshop room talking about our stuff and not with a large audience. So we get to kind of love on each other in this way, which is, I think, so important for scholars to do for each other, especially those of us who are doing this really difficult work of recuperating this history and grappling with it in the midst of everything that's happening. But that was, to get back to this, that was one of the things that I found so enraging about, from journalists, to be quite honest with you, when, SB 8 in Texas became the law of the land, one of the most aggressive anti-abortion laws in the United States. And then literally a week later, Mexico's Supreme Court begins to decriminalize abortion access. And as Elizabeth said, so, the president of the Supreme Court just so eloquently and beautifully stated why this was something that Mexico needed to push forward in a way that was really about combating gender-based violence, right? And so it was amazing. And I happen to be one of the few people, right, aside from Elizabeth, who writes about these two things, right? Writes about Texas and writes about Mexico. And so I was getting flooded with journalist questions, and they were like, make it make sense. How is it that such a Catholic country like Mexico could be advancing while the US is going backwards? What do we do? What do we do with this? And it was very frustrating, to say the least, for me to have to say, why would you think, Ireland has decriminalized abortion, many years ago? So like, what about religion do you see as not connected to politics? Right? How do you think, why is religion, especially in the global South, somehow divorced from the sort of social and political milieu of its societies? That's not possible, right? And so for me, like in the US, it's been fascinating giving the history of abortion, and students are like oftentimes shocked that the interest in religion, especially by evangelicals, is something much more recent, right? That it's something that really develops not really into the 1940s and 50s. And it's not even after Roe v. Wade that there really is a consolidation. And I know Mickey Burdick knows a lot about this history because this is the work that they do, right? But that consolidation doesn't happen until after Roe. And students are like, oh, we thought it was like forever. I'm like, no, in the 19th century in the US, it had a lot to do with the medical profession trying to professionalize itself on the backs of reproducing people, right? On the one hand, and on the other, again, racism constantly creeping up into this conversation and trying to figure out, in the shadow of slavery and in the aftermath of the end of slavery, what is our world going to look like now that we are not only having immigration from Europe, from China, from Mexico, but now we have a free Black population. And so what does that look like? And given the statistics that physicians had at the time, the majority of people who were availing themselves of abortion were white women, right? And so this is, again, and it dovetails with the history of eugenics in the late 19th century. So like doing that kind of, like bringing all that together and oftentimes pushing back on these, problematic and oftentimes, obscuring discourses on religion, quite frankly, allow for politicians, oftentimes unsophisticated thinkers, to manipulate these histories and to manipulate people's faith, right? This is a conversation I often have here with students who are, rightfully so, a conviction that they have, and they think a conviction that's always been part of their religion. And I have to say, no. And they're shocked, and they feel tricked, they feel fooled. that politicians have manipulated their faith in this way, right? And so I think the work that both Elizabeth and I are doing is really, trying to honor, right, the way that people understand their own faith, and especially Catholics who, some of our elders who have for decades been supporting access to reproductive care and reproductive health care in ways that, at least, for instance, in the US, and I'll be quiet after this, for instance, white feminists have always considered was non-existent, right? That Latinas were and have always been concerned with bodily autonomy and concerned with the care of their communities, but in ways that white feminists could not often see or make sense of, because it was not under this sort of prescription of what white feminists, especially middle-class white feminists, feminism should look like and those people should act like. And so I think that that's the work that we're trying to sort of do in a moment of like deep polarization, to bring nuance, right? And to show that actually some of these ideas are not as old as we think, and certainly should not have a stronghold on our society in the way that they do.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. I love the question about, what about religion do you see as separate from politics? Like, it's very much ingrained in our reproductive politics across nationhood and borders, as well as our own political sort of orientation. So thank you for both of you for bringing that up. I want to ask you both, now that we definitely know the goals of your scholarship and what we know your orientations to it and your experiences, and your really nuanced and thoughtful analyses. But I want to ask a little bit about what you see are some of the main challenges, and maybe this is a time, Dr. Murillo, you talked about sort of place and, just dealing with the constrictions of space and where you are, and also just political orientations. So what do you see as some of the main challenges and opportunities for realizing these goals that you set out for your work? So would love to hear some concrete examples from maybe your own experiences or things that you've experienced or will experience, you believe. So the main challenges and opportunities that your work sets out to achieve. So Dr. O'Brien, if you want to start first, that would be great.
Sure. Well, just, first of all, I couldn't co-sign more enthusiastically everything that Dr. Murillo just said. I mean, that was really powerful and gave me a lot to think about. And, one thing that I wanted to bring up was, something that's on all of our minds, obviously, the looming threat of Christian nationalism, or this movement that's really neo-fascist and authoritarian, but that, positions itself as Christian nationalism in part, like Dr. Murillo just said, to exploit, people's, you know, um, faith-based commitments, right? So, a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives, a lot of neo-fascists, white supremacists, domestic terrorists in the United States are trying to pretend that they haven't been laying the groundwork for ever more authoritarian and violent usurpations of people's reproductive freedoms. And they're trying to pretend that because they've seen how deeply unpopular it is. This is, we've all seen it. We've all been seeing, the, felonious and violent, sexual assaulter, rapist, presidential candidate saying, well, look, I never would have guessed what happened in Ohio. Look at that vote. Oh, makes so, but don't believe them. Obviously, don't believe them. They're blatantly co-opting reproductive justice rhetoric, and it's sick. It's sick to see JD Vance pretending that he cares about enacting pro-family and justice-oriented policies like cheaper daycare and meals and, I don't even think he said access to contraceptives, but he made it sound like that was something that he would be supportive of, but they're not sincere. Obviously, we know that the United States is so far behind in terms of childcare, education, nutrition, housing justice, and maternal and paternal leave policies. And, as we've already said, we have a lot of catching up to do and all of those things. It is due to these, like deeply rooted white supremacist movements. I really, really enjoyed Dr. Murillo's reflection on, the professionalization of obstetrics as a branch of medicine, as its own discipline, is absolutely born in slavery and debates, about what are we going to do now, like in these abolition years. And then, of course, everything about like the United States healthcare system, is so strongly related to Jim Crow policies, for example. So it's always also about race. It's very, very, very much about and that's why we can't understand it without reading Killing the Black Body, right? That we can't understand restrictions on abortion without understanding how those are fundamentally tied to coercive and non-consensual sterilization. They are two sides of the same coin. Um, One thing that I loved in a recent trip to Texas was that when I sat in a hotel lobby near the airport for 25 minutes, I saw 3 times a political ad starring some of the women who have sued the state of Texas for, their near death experiences as a direct result of, predictable and highly preventable, terrible maternal health policy, aka the draconian near total ban on all pregnancy termination, including pregnancies that have no chance of surviving, like ectopic pregnancies. And these women were opposing Ted Cruz's reelection on the basis that he supports these policies that almost killed them, right? And so seeing that commercial playing on loop and watching people watch it and interact with it gave me hope, just like the youth give me hope, just like leaders in Latin America give me hope. And so in my discipline, in the history of medicine, it's always a challenge to read sources against the grain and find alternative discourses, in the way that Dr. Murillo has done, so successfully in her book, by not just looking at medical history. If you're studying eugenics, you shouldn't just read the writings of eugenicists. You should also look at it, from the perspective of economics, of racial state formation, of migration, of local politics. And so, yeah, just again, a shout out for her methodology there. And that's all I have to say on that.
Oh, well, this is where maybe my love fest with Elizabeth ends, because she's in California. And so, for some of us who are not in states that are enshrining these critical things in their, state constitutions and their basic, honoring people's basic rights, it becomes much more difficult, right? And you can see, I think, to Elizabeth's point, right, the contrast when you travel to states like Texas, or or now coming to the Midwest. Iowa has the sad distinction of being one of the more recent states to enact a 6-week ban. And this is a state that at this very moment has, I think, the lowest in the country per capita of OBGYNs. They are closing hospitals across the state. This is a very rural state, but nonetheless, that has population living in rural hospitals. And so now people, or rural areas with no hospitals. So now people find themselves having to travel sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 hours, not just like within the state of Iowa, but actually having to, cross borders into Nebraska, into Minnesota, into Illinois, into Wisconsin, well, no one's going to Missouri, let's be real. But right, they've got it worse than we do. But traveling really long distances to get prenatal care, let alone other kinds of reproductive health care, right? And so writing about the precariousness of reproductive care in the past while living in it is very scary. It is very frustrating and enraging, especially when we know that the policies and the laws that are being put forth are just wholeheartedly anti-democratic, not just undemocratic, they are anti-democratic. I mean, they're both, right? So undemocratic in that when they poll people in most states, right? But I'll take Iowa because this is where I live. This is my home now. As a former Californian, I'll say I was originally from the Bay Area. But when they polled Iowa, overwhelmingly, I think it's something at like 67 or almost 70% of people, of women actually, I should say that, of women polled, they are pro reproductive rights, right? So this includes conservative people, conservative women. So it's undemocratic in that way. And it's anti-democratic because we know, right, that in order for us to be full participants in a democracy, fundamentally, at a very basic level, we should have authority and sovereignty over our bodies. And we do not have that, right? Whether you are a person seeking an abortion, whether you are a person seeking various kinds of gender affirming care, I consider access to abortion a form of gender affirming care, but also trans folks who are trying to get medications. All of those things are part of I think a huge panoply of gender affirming care, healthcare. To deny people that, right, is a form of anti-democracy. And so if that is the kind of place that you are supporting, if those are the ideas that you're supporting, then you are very much, right, not actually concerned with preserving democracy or expanding democracy, right? And we can connect this to all sorts of other things like the right to vote, right, the right to housing, the right to being fed, and this is so critical to an RJ ethos, an RJ sort of positionality and framing, right? That third prong, the right to raise our families in safe and sustainable communities. We can't even vote for what a safe and sustainable community looks like in certain places in this country. And so I think, writing and doing research in this particular moment is really daunting. It is it is overwhelming, especially when not only that, but states are now criminalizing the things that we can say and cannot say. As academics, I know that a lot of us sort of hang our hat on the academic freedom, but that is always subject for debate, apparently. Right, not to mention our sweet children in K through 12 education in states like Iowa, they are facing book bans, and their librarians and their teachers are afraid to speak for fear of being fired, and losing their teaching licenses. I mean, all of these things, right, I want to say are interconnected and making it very difficult for us to do our job on the one hand, but on the other, to Elizabeth's point, the thing that gives me hope is that the youth are like, hell no, right? And also that our elders are also like, hell no. And I think that there needs to be, and here I'm also going to shout out some of my wonderful and beautiful colleagues who have been writing incredible books. Right now, I'm thinking of Natalie Lida's work on sterilization in California, Alondra Nelson, and just thinking about social movement, organizing and activism in the Black Panther Party, where we have these incredible histories that show how people have done this kind of work in the past. I think I'm thinking of Marisela Chavez's book, Chicana historian who just wrote and sort of coins this term bridging activism, and how intergenerational and multi-generational social justice movements actually work, that we need our elders working with our youth to have these kinds of multi-generational and transgenerational conversations about what organizing looks like for for imagining new possibilities, right? As many people have been saying, like Roe was the floor. Roe was not supposed to be the end all be all, right? And so now we don't have Roe anymore. So what is the thing that we're going to do in the meantime? Because the state isn't gonna come and save us anytime soon. It's a mess, right? Like the state is a mess, despite us believing wholeheartedly that it should be that it should be held responsible for our care. We also need to think about how we're going to care for each other. And I think the past, looking to the histories of organizers in the past, is so needed right now.
Thank you both for your brave and wonderful work. I just wanted to snap after both of your just after everything you've both said. And as I'm sort of recapping, feel free to keep putting questions in the chat. I know we have a few, and we have a few for you as we go on. But I love the idea of thinking about and looking toward the past to think about how we can organize and take care of each other in the future. I love that, what you said, Dr. Murillo. And then for Dr. O'Brien, I love earlier in our conversation, you said the past is inseparable from our reproductive futures. And that really stuck out with me. And I just think it is a testament to how important historical work is for our current political moment. While it might seem out of reach, it truly is so important. I thank you both for doing that work. I think that these themes of sort of medical knowledge being about social issues and social constructs and not just political sort of orientations is really important. And othering those who have always been fighting against reproductive justice is something that states and also people in power are constantly doing. So I'd love to, go to our questions and hear some of these themes being reiterated, but also maybe seeing what other people have to talk about. So, Risa, would you like to start us off with a question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And also just noting we have a couple questions in the chat that we'll transition to here in a second. So thank you for popping those in. Please don't hesitate to add to the list. So just want to underscore something that Mickey just said.
Do you want to show us your video? Because we can't see you. Or maybe
do I want to show you? Yeah. Hi, here she is. Underscore point in Mickey's summation remarks about the importance of history. It's not lost on me at all. As an anthropologist who has sincere and deep respect and regard for that other tradition that made gender thinkable, for instance, in a critical way, as well as disturbs dominant ideas about life as it is. So history has very powerfully been able to do that. And so connecting the past with our, not just present, but our future is incredibly powerful. And so just want to invite one invitation here as experts of that method to sort of make that deep pitch for why is history so important beyond the points that you've already made here, that it teaches us that contemporary life isn't as old or enduring as dominant narratives might suggest. It is more magical and important beyond that really important point. And so I want to give you a chance as methodologists to really make a strong pitch for history. And a second sort of set of questions is we heard some incredibly important and contributive critiques to both the explicit and the implicit work of religious institutions and leaders in undermining racial and reproductive justice. And I'm curious, in your work, whether in the academy, teaching, mentoring, or in community, you have encountered religious leaders and supporters of racial and reproductive justice that you might wish to amplify or lift up, recognizing that those the ways that those ideologies and tools get wielded by those in power aren't the only way those ideologies and tools might be used. So just curious if what you might have learned that we could also learn from too.
I mean, I can, quickly say the pitch for history. I think that, as somebody who does, so I teach some of the introduction to gender, women, sexuality studies classes at the University of Iowa. So I have the distinct pleasure of trying to convince a room full of 150 undergrads that they should get a major, despite what their parents might want, that they should be majoring in gender, women, sexuality studies. But one of the ways I do that is actually by teaching like social construction theory. So like shout out to sociologists and anthropologists who've like been doing this. But I do it through history, right? So to show how certain ideas that people might have, for instance, about gender today are socially constructed. And the best way to understand that is to like, let's look at the past and let's look at, let's say 100 years and see how this idea of like what it means to be a woman or a man has changed over time, and how it's not just because people wanted to change, but because power structures only saw people, right? Only saw people as people if they dressed a certain way, if they spoke a certain way, if they act right. And so all of these kinds of nuances about what it means to be an individual, then connecting it to like a group and society, and then showing students how these ideas have changed over time, how like in the 1920s there were like drag balls and people would dress up and party, and then like all of a sudden this goes underground and then it comes back up, and they're like, oh, I just thought that drag was something that was invented by like RuPaul and it's a show, right? Like they don't understand that actually people have been transgressing gender for, I do 100 years because I can't go that far back, but I'm like, that people are always transgressing these things, right? And so that allows them to kind of say like, oh, so this is our thing in history, there's change over time. Even though certain ideas persist and oppression persists, the way that people understand that has changed over time. And so there is a possibility to push back on certain things that we think like, this is impossible. We can't, it's like, no, the possibility is never foreclosed on. And so for me, that's the pitch for history, is that you bring the receipts, right? You bring the evidence of how people acted in the past. And you can say, man, if people were doing this in the past, if people were doing this under slavery, if people were doing this when they were being dislocated from their lands, when like life expectancy was like barely 30, right? Like we can do this now. We can do this kind of work now. So that's my pitch for history. I'll let Elizabeth do the other.
Well, I love that. That was history as inspiration. And that's what it is. It's inspiration, that we know that we're heading, towards more authoritarian responses to social movements, with threats of being killed during protest, that have been more of a reality for people throughout history and different times and spaces that face greater burdens of oppression and marginalization. And so we see that happening, and yet as Lina just so brilliantly said, can be inspired to act and change our situations in ways that as you also said, the state isn't going to do shit for us. We have to demand it, right? We have to demand what we want. That's how change happens. And then also just, in the history of science and medicine, one of the things that I love about history is that, it scales from the individual to the global, or even, the intergalactic, I guess, and so, we care about what individuals thought and said and did and what their motivations were. But we also can place that into broader scales of analysis and, if not like, obviously we can't, make kind of direct claims about causality and outcome. However, in things like history of science and medicine, we can pinpoint exactly when and why and where incredibly harmful data sets were literally incorporated into things that physicians, practitioners, researchers, and scientists use to shape their own research questions, processes, and outcomes without questioning the history of those at all. And so, what I'm speaking to here is, like Lina already said, Alondra Nelson, but, and I've already said Dorothy Roberts, but again, and Ruha Benjamin, and, tons and tons and tons of people who are working on these questions. David Jones, other people have shown that, the literal therapeutic calculators that that physicians use to make treatment decisions, diagnostic, and, you know, do I intervene? Do I not? Does insurance pay? Does insurance not? You know, does this person get this treatment? Do they not? Are shaped by eugenic databases and racial science, everything from the vaginal birth after cesarean calculator to nephrology calculators to, you know, assumptions about people of color and the level of pain that they experience in like the toddler UTI calculator. I mean, the data shapes, like, it's rooted in eugenics and, you know, the explosion of the age of data and modernity, and it shapes real health outcomes. And then I see the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful reproductive justice and abortion and reproductive history scholar Cassia Roth in the chat, and just want to shout out, you know, to her work as well. She shows, you know, in part, she does so many things in her book, A Miscarriage of Justice, which I want to highly recommend and plug. It's about Brazilian women's reproductive health experiences, predominantly impoverished African descendant Brazilian women's experiences. And one of the things that she shows is that sometimes when they were accused of and prosecuted for infanticide, in reality, what they were experiencing was neglect. They were experiencing medical neglect and they were doubly punished for it. And lo and behold, we see a lot of that in the United States and elsewhere today. And so, yeah, history gives us tools for understanding these things, right?
I
Yeah.
think Risa had a question about religion. And so I do want to kind of circle a little bit back to that, because I do think that I do think the case of Mexico is so fascinating with religion and reproduction. And so I'll give a quick example. For instance, along the U.S.-Mexico border, because it had such a long history of underground abortion provision in a good part of the 20th century, at least until Roe in the US, but even past that, when that came to light nationally, at least in the US, it was the way that US-based physicians sort of pivoted to attack their colleagues in Mexico was very swift and brutal. Mexican authorities, law enforcement, you know, worked alongside US law enforcement to kind of clamp down on these underground abortion providers in Mexico. And so this brought like a stain, right, of like, to make matters worse, right? Not that Mexico had not always already been sort of racialized as a backward nation, but now they were providing people with potentially life-threatening medical procedures and they were racialized as not knowing what they were doing, all of those things. So in light of that, Mexican, the Catholics in Mexico, especially priests and the archbishop, and they began to sort of take their foot off of we won't engage in conversations around contraception, because if it allows the sort of abortion issue to go away, then we will oftentimes openly support access to contraception. And that's what they do, at least in Juarez. And so the person who I'm calling the Margaret Sanger of Mexico, Guadalupe Arizpe de la Vega, you know, becomes kind of like this, like, you know, the face of population control in Mexico, especially along the border. And she partners with a lot of priests to bring contraception to this region. And then she goes and does like speaking tours in the US. And so all of these US population control advocates in the late 1970s and early 80s are like, how did you do it? Like, how, you know, as a Catholic, like, what are you? And she's like, oh, the priests don't have any problem with me. They think I'm fabulous. They think I'm whatever. But she negates the longer story, right, of this abortion question in Mexico. And so again, to get back to this, like, it's always political, right? And you know, we in Latin America, I put myself in the we category as a Latin Americanist and Latin American thinker, but I'm going to do that for now. But we often include religion as part of the state, right? It's always a conversation when we talk about the state. We don't do that in the United States. American exceptionalism actually, I think, clouds us from thinking about it that way. But we certainly should, right? We certainly should think about religion as and especially now that it is the sort of the fourth prong of the state in the U.S.
If I could just really quickly, that was such a brilliant description of that, of religion and the state. And it just really chives, of course, with, most people will know this, but Lynn Morgan and Elizabeth Roberts, right? When they theorized reproductive governance in the early 2000s, very much in conversation with reproductive justice, they, explicitly included religious institutions as part of the state. Yeah, and just, going along with your example, I loved hearing about this, interplay. But there's a colleague who is now in Illinois, Marta Liliana Espinosa, who worked on the trials of hormonal contraception in Michoacan and Mexico City. And she shows that in Michoacan, in the Catholic community, there was not only great demand for access to hormonal contraception, but also that the priest was literally on the team, like the counseling body of women who were trialing this. I'll stop myself there.
Thank you both for those answers. I just want to quickly ask some questions that we have in the chat. There were two questions from participants that wanted a sort of more granular understanding of the, comparative differences around reproduction in like the borderlands and beyond. So Megan said that Dr. Murillo talked about her focus on violence against women, but do either of you see a difference between the US and Mexico, sort of within that gendered violence? So for instance, is this sort of pro-choice or anti-abortion framework the same in the US and Mexico, or how is it different? And then, there are also a lot of different immigration patterns from into the US, right? Not only over the US-Mexico border from Mexican origin women and people, but also Central American migrants. What are some unique challenges around that? I know that's a lot of questions for the little time we have, but I would love to hear if anything sparks something from you all. Please feel free to answer.
I can address that. I'm looking at the question here about immigration. And yes, I mean, there's certainly lots of challenges. And yeah, people are coming from Central America, they're coming from South America, they're coming from the Caribbean. It's, a couple of students actually here at the University of Iowa who are about to engage in some research in the Darien Gap, an area that for a long time, I want to say probably over 100 years, had not really been traversed in the way, or ever. I don't know enough about that particular region, but traversed in the way that it is now. And so I would say that one of the things that especially I would say abortion funds in the borderland are dealing with has been the amount of people that are coming over who have been sexually assaulted on their journey and who are seeking access to abortion. And in fact, when Trump was president, there were several cases that went before that were tried in Texas about securing migrants access to abortion, and a lot of questions about who was covered under the Constitution, which is bananas, given that we know that even if you are not a US citizen, you are still able to tap into rights under the Constitution of the United States if you are in the United States. And so these and all sorts of nefarious, I mean, to talk to Elizabeth's conversation about data, right? This is when the infamous sort of period tracker, and I'm forgetting this person's name, who then went on to work for the Department of Education, and Scott Lloyd. There's the name of the man, who was the head of that particular section of like Homeland Security, overseeing, and he was one of the people that was basically went out of his way to track the periods of undocumented people as they were coming over the border, and especially those who wanted access to abortion. So like these questions are ever present in migration, and certainly also folks who are migrating from places like Mexico, where they have access to abortion, to places like the US where they do not, right? And so there's a long history, and I don't have time to get into it now because I want to let Elizabeth answer the other question, but there's a long history of people traveling both north and south, right, in various directions to access reproductive care, and we're seeing it now.
No, that was a great, answer. And, I just, in response to the question about, comparative, US Mexico feminist movements, backlash to feminist movements, discourses about, people with uteruses obligation to become pregnant and bear children. I have to say I have a lot of thoughts, but nothing that I'm, convinced should take up everybody's time. And I just wonder if there are other people in the room, who potentially were, involved in some of these feminist movements or want to offer their own reflections or experiences in transnational feminist movements. I know Cassia Roth's here. I don't know if Cassia Roth has been interviewing abortion and reproductive justice activists across Latin America, including older generations that have been fighting since the 60s and 70s. So is that okay?
I just had the pleasure of spending time with her this past weekend, where she talked about her recent work in Brazil, and talking to. Are you there?
I would much rather hear from her.
Yeah, let's go. All right. So first of all, how'd the meeting go? It wasn't that bad, actually.
Oh, that's somebody else. That's somebody
It
else.
is.
I'm muting. Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. This was amazing. I'll just say that I think from the basic interviews I've done so far is understanding the state violence that feminists organize against, which both Elizabeth and Lina-Maria have written about, but the state violence in the second half, mainly in the second half of the 20th century, which was supported by the United States of America, but which involved the mass disappearance and torture of people. Feminists organized against that, and that was a very powerful way and a terrifying time to organize, right? And so I think a lot of the sort of decriminalization movements of abortion that started in the 70s and 80s drew directly from that. And that is not something the second wave feminists in the United States ever dealt with, right? I mean, okay, let me walk that back, because we know that Black feminists, feminists of color in the United States, have had to deal with terror and state violence throughout history. But the second wave, who started sort of, mainly white middle-class feminists, have never had to deal with the state terror in that way. And that's not necessarily true in Latin America. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I just added in the chat that this is the kind of disappearance and state torture against leftists that Trump is openly advocating for in, like election, events, right?
Yes. On day one, no less. On day one, no less. And I would argue that there are, and if for folks who are interested, I mean, I don't mean to throw Elizabeth in here, but we're here. But if folks are interested in continuing these conversations, or if they have more questions for us, they can certainly reach out to us. This is the work that we do, and it is very, unfortunately, so timely. And also just the idea of, you know, if we can end with this, if that's okay, but the idea that that we are all soon to become migrants of in some form or another. And I would argue that if we're thinking about people crossing the US-Mexico border for abortion care from the US to Mexico, then we also in the same vein have to include the people who are traveling from other parts into the US for a different kind of reproductive justice, right? For a justice to raise their children in safe and sustainable communities. And we can discuss with the rampant amount of gun violence in the US whether or not this is a safe and sustainable community, but folks are making those calculations. And so I think that we're also entering not only a moment of fascism, but also a moment of transnational migration that we've not probably seen for millennia. And so we need to begin to think about each other in that way, right? That we will need to move for care for ourselves and to protect ourselves and our families and our communities.
What a beautiful ending note. I could not agree more.
What an amazing conversation this has been. I want to thank our speakers and Mickey for moderating such an inspiring conversation. I have always been jealous of historians, but as you put it today, history is also inspiration. And that's really what I feel from this conversation. And I also just want to say that listening to all of you as a feminist scholar, it's not every day that you hear people not just talking about their own work, but really helping us see the beauty that we see in each other's work. So I really want to thank you for sharing a space for that. Thank you again to all the participants, and I would like to invite those of you who would like to continue the conversation. Our next session is scheduled for Tuesday, November 6th, between 12 and 1:30. The topic of the discussion will really continue some of the stuff that we spoke about today. We will be talking about people of faith and abortion with Zara Ayubi, Toddy Peters, Michal Rauscher, and Monique Moultrie. And you're all invited to be in touch, come to whatever works for you, and continue all the amazing work that you do, whether it's scholarship or activism. These are hard times and it's so important. So thank you all for being part of this conversation.
Thank you for creating such a beautiful space.
Echoing that, thanks. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who was here.
Yeah, thank you.